spooky place.
The unseen patient. It was one of those lazy Saturday afternoons when the weather couldn't decide whether to rain or shine. I'd been wandering downtown, passing through the quieter streets where the chain stores faded away, replaced by small, quirky shops. That's when I stumbled across it, a tiny antique store sandwiched between a shuttered bakery and a pawn shop. The sign above the door was faded, the lettering barely legible, curiosities and treasures. The display window was cluttered with old trinkets, a brass gramophone, a faded porcelain doll, and a dusty clock frozen in time. Something about the place felt inviting, or maybe it was just the mystery of what lay inside. The door creaked loudly as I stepped in, the sound echoing in the quiet, dimly lit space. The smell of aged wood and mothballs hit me immediately, mingling with a faint, sweet scent I couldn't quite place. The shop was a maze of narrow aisles, every surface crammed with objects, candlesticks, vintage postcards, jewelry boxes with missing keys. "Let me know if you need help finding something," a voice called from behind the counter. The shopkeeper was an older man with wiry glasses and a vaguely distracted air, like he spent more time with the objects than the people who came to buy them. "Just browsing," I replied, running my fingers over a cracked leather-bound book. That's when I saw it. The mirror stood at the back of the shop, leaning against a stack of crates, as though it had been forgotten. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and framed in intricately carved dark wood. Vines and flowers twisted along its edges. The craftsmanship, so detailed it looked like they might start growing any second. But what struck me most was the glass itself. It wasn't the usual flat, reflective surface. It seemed to shimmer, almost as if there was a thin layer of water rippling beneath the surface. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in its depths, but when I blinked, it was gone. "How much for the mirror?" I asked, my voice echoing strangely in the stillness. The shopkeeper looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "That one's not for sale," he said, his tone abrupt. "Why not?" "It's complicated." He hesitated, then sighed. "Let's just say some things are better left alone." But the more he refused, the more I wanted it. I offered him twice what I thought it was worth, and after a long pause, he relented. "Fine," he said, his voice low, "but don't say I didn't warn you." As I loaded the mirror into my car, I noticed the shopkeeper watching me from the doorway, his expression a mix of pity and relief. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I realize I should have. At first, the mirror seemed like nothing more than a beautiful antique. I placed it in the corner of my bedroom, where its dark, intricate frame added a touch of elegance to the otherwise plain space. The first few nights, I barely noticed it. I was too busy scrolling on my phone, catching up on work, or falling asleep in front of the TV. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the reflections. One night, I was getting ready for bed, brushing my hair in front of the mirror. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange in the reflection. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The room in the mirror didn't quite match the room around me. The walls seemed darker, the shadows deeper. I turned around, scanning the actual room, but everything looked normal. When I faced the mirror again, it was just my reflection staring back. I told myself I was imagining things, but then it happened again. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I glanced at the mirror. This time, it was unmistakable. There was movement in the glass. Not my reflection, not anything in the room. It was something else, a figure. It was faint, almost translucent, but definitely there. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and expressionless. She was standing in the reflection of the room, but not in the actual room. My breath caught, and I sat up, staring at the glass. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring back at me. I wanted to look away, to run, but I couldn't. It felt like her eyes were holding me in place. Finally, I blinked, and she was gone. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. During the day, it seemed normal, almost ordinary, but at night, it felt alive. The nightmare started a week later. Every night, I'd find myself in the same dream. I was standing in front of the mirror, but the reflection wasn't mine. It was a woman's. Her pale, hollow eyes stared at me as her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Each dream ended the same way. Her hand reached out from the glass, her cold fingers brushing against mine. That's when I'd wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the fact that I started waking up to find things out of place. One night, I woke up to see the chair in the corner of my room facing the mirror, though I was sure I'd left it facing the desk. Another time, I found the mirror tilted slightly, as if someone had been trying to move it. And then there were the handprints. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I noticed faint smudges on the glass. They were shaped like handprints, but they were too small to be mine. By the second week, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur at the edge of my hearing, like a distant conversation in another room. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, urgent, and angry. They always started late at night, usually when I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. "Who's there?" I'd call out, my voice shaky, but the whispers would stop the moment I spoke. One night, I finally worked up the courage to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around the room, checking every corner, every shadow. But as soon as I turned my back to the mirror, the whispers grew louder, sharper. I spun around, shining the flashlight on the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something, movement, a face, but it vanished before I could focus on it. The whispers stopped, but the room didn't feel empty. The turning point came on a night when I was too exhausted to be scared anymore. I'd been lying awake for hours, the whispers growing louder, the mirror casting strange reflections even in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, grabbed a blanket, and threw it over the mirror. For the first time in weeks, the room felt quiet, but that peace didn't last. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud crash. My heart racing, I turned on the light to find the blanket on the floor and the mirror tilted forward, as though it had tried to fall. And in the glass, the woman was staring back at me. This time, she wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of shadowy figures crowding behind her, their faces blank and hollow. They pressed against the inside of the glass, their hands smearing the surface as if trying to push through. And then I heard it. A voice, clear and cold, spoke from the mirror. "Let us out." The voice from the mirror sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they echoed, as if spoken from every corner of the room. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The figures in the mirror pressed closer, their hollow faces growing sharper, more defined. "Let us out," the voice repeated, louder this time. The surface of the glass began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. I stepped back, but the air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. The figure's hands clawed at the glass, their movements frantic, desperate. Cracks began to form on the surface, spiderwebbing outward from where their hands pressed. The room felt alive with energy, the hum I'd felt before now deafening. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows in the corners twisting and shifting. I tried to turn away, to run, but something held me in place. "You brought us here," the voice said, now layered with multiple tones, as if all the figures were speaking at once. "You can't leave." I grabbed the first thing I could find, a heavy paperweight from my desk, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying in every direction. For a moment, everything went still, and then chaos. From the shattered remains of the mirror, a black mist began to pour out, swirling and writhing like smoke caught in a windstorm. The mist filled the room, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread. The figures stepped out of the mirror, one by one. They weren't ghosts. They were something else, something far worse. Their bodies were shadowy and insubstantial, but their faces were human. Twisted, anguished, and hungry. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were unused to walking in this world. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. The woman from the dreams stepped forward, her eyes locking onto mine. For the first time, she spoke, her voice soft and cold. "You took the mirror," she said. "You took our prison. Now you must take our place." Before I could react, the figures lunged at me, their shadowy hands reaching out. I screamed, thrashing and kicking, but their grip was like ice, draining the strength from my body. And then I felt it, the pull. Everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in a room that looked exactly like mine, but wrong. The colors were muted, the air heavy and still. I turned to face the mirror, or what was left of it, and froze. On the other side of the glass, I saw my bedroom. The real one. I saw myself, or at least, the thing that looked like me, standing in the room, staring at the shattered remains of the mirror with a satisfied smile. I screamed, pounding on the glass, but no sound came out. The woman appeared beside me, her expression unreadable. "Now you understand," she said. "This is where we were trapped. And now, it's where you'll stay." The last thing I saw before the world around me went completely dark was my reflection, the thing that had taken my place, picking up a piece of the shattered mirror and whispering, "Time to find the next one." Weeks later, the mirror appeared back in the antique shop, perfectly restored, the cracks gone. A young couple walked in, admiring the trinkets. The woman's eyes lit up when she saw the mirror, its frame gleaming as if freshly polished. "How much for this?" she asked the shopkeeper. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on the glass. For a moment, it seemed as though he might refuse. But then he sighed. "Make me an offer," he said. The mirror was sold that afternoon, and the cycle began again. The carnival of lost souls. It was the kind of place you'd call charming if you were trying to be polite. The apartment building was old, with creaky wooden floors and chipped paint on the walls, but it was cheap and in a decent neighborhood. Two things that mattered most when you're on a budget. The day I moved in, the landlord handed me the keys with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's an old building," he said, almost as a warning. "Things might creak, and the pipes aren't always cooperative. But you'll get used to it." I shrugged it off. I'd lived in worse places. The apartment itself wasn't bad, small but cozy. The furniture was mismatched and outdated, clearly left behind by the last tenant, but the windows let in plenty of light, and there was something homey about it. Except for the stairs. The apartment was on the second floor, and the staircase leading up to it was narrow and dark, the wooden steps worn smooth by decades of use. A single dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Every time I went up or down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked a few boxes, ordered takeout, and fell asleep on the couch. But by the second night, I started noticing things. It began with sounds. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, like faint footsteps coming from the stairs. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but as the night wore on, the noises grew louder, more distinct. Then there was the shadow. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I caught it out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape moved across the wall opposite the staircase, slow and deliberate, like someone walking past. My heart jumped, and I turned toward the stairs, expecting to see someone. But they were empty. I laughed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. It was an old building, after all, and shadows could play tricks in the dim light. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs. This time, they stopped just outside my bedroom door. At first, life in the building seemed uneventful. Days turned into weeks, and everything felt ordinary. But every so often, I'd catch myself thinking about that strange night, The way the landlord had dismissed my questions, the silence in the halls, and the way the building felt too big for its occupants. Still, I try to focus on settling in. My days were busy with work, and my evenings were spent decorating my apartment, finding the perfect spot for the art pieces I'd collected over the years. But then little things started to feel off. It began with the lights in the hallway outside my apartment. Sometimes, they'd flicker when I stepped out late at night, plunging the hallway into darkness for a few unsettling seconds before buzzing back to life. I try to laugh it off. Old wiring, I told myself. But it wasn't just the lights. I started to notice sounds. Late at night, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, as though someone were pacing outside my door. The first time it happened, I thought it was one of the other tenants. Maybe someone coming home late or taking a walk to clear their head. But when I peeked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped as soon as I looked. This became a regular occurrence. Night after night, I'd hear the same footsteps, always stopping outside my door. But no matter how quickly I looked, there was never anyone there. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with my phone's flashlight, I yanked the door open and stepped into the hallway. Nothing. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the silence was oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing, before retreating back into my apartment. That was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I started paying attention to the other tenants that things got really strange. During the day, I'd sometimes hear faint noises, muffled conversations, the clink of dishes, or the hum of a TV. But I never actually saw anyone. I began leaving my apartment earlier than usual, hoping to catch a glimpse of my neighbors. But no matter how early I left or how late I came home, the halls were always empty. I decided to visit the landlord again. "Are you sure this building isn't vacant?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He gave me the same dismissive smile. "Of course not. People keep to themselves here. That's why they like it." His answer didn't sit right with me, so I started to look for answers myself. I decided to test my theory. One evening, after hearing faint music coming from the apartment next door, I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. The music stopped abruptly. Feeling a chill crawl up my spine, I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked. But it wasn't. The door creaked open to reveal a perfectly clean, fully furnished apartment. There was no sign of anyone living there. No personal items, no clutter, nothing. Just an immaculate, sterile space that felt more like a staged home than a real one. I quickly shut the door and stepped back, my pulse racing. It didn't make sense. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I began testing the doors on my floor, one by one. Most of them were locked, but the ones that weren't all revealed the same thing. Empty apartments, pristine and untouched, as though they were waiting for someone to move in. Except for one. At the end of the hall was an apartment with a heavy iron door that didn't match the others. It was old and scratched, with a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been turned in years. Unlike the others, this door wasn't welcoming. It radiated a strange energy, as though it didn't want to be approached. But something about it drew me in. I reached out, hesitating as my hand hovered over the handle. Just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a loud bang echoed from behind the door, making me jump back. I stumbled down the hall, my heart pounding, and locked myself in my apartment. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, faster, as though whoever, or whatever, was pacing outside my door was angry. And then I heard it, a faint knock at my door. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I went online, searching for any mention of the building. That's when I found it, an old article about the property, dated over 50 years ago. The photo accompanying the article showed a group of tenants standing outside the building, smiling for the camera. I scanned their faces, but one detail made my blood run cold. One of the tenants in the photo was the landlord. He hadn't aged a day. The photo of the landlord wouldn't leave my mind. How could he look the same as he did 50 years ago? I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, a relative, maybe, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I decided to confront him. That evening, I went to his office, clutching a printout of the article. The small space smelled faintly of mildew and old paper, and the landlord sat behind his desk, scribbling in a leather-bound ledger. "I found this," I said, placing the article in front of him. "Care to explain?" He barely glanced at it before letting out a low chuckle. "You should have minded your own business," he said, his voice calm but with an edge that made my stomach turn. "What's going on in this building?" I demanded. "The footsteps, the empty apartments, What are you hiding?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone suddenly cold. "You were never supposed to move in." I froze as he stood, his presence suddenly feeling much larger, more imposing. "This building has its rules, its tenants, and you've disrupted the balance." Before I could respond, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The office was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds. A low hum filled the air, the same oppressive sound I'd heard in my apartment late at night. I turned toward the door, ready to flee, but it was gone. The office walls seemed to stretch and twist, the space around me warping like a nightmare. And then I saw them. The figures stepped out of the shadows, one by one. They were the tenants from the photograph, but their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes black voids. They didn't walk, they drifted, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. "You shouldn't be here," one of them whispered, their voice barely audible, but somehow deafening. I backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" I choked out. The landlord stepped forward, his face eerily calm despite the chaos around us. "This building isn't a home," he said. "It's a trap. The tenants, they're bound here, tied to this place for eternity. And now, so are you." "No!" I screamed, turning and running blindly into the darkness. I stumbled through the warped halls of the building, the walls shifting and closing in around me. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. The tenants were everywhere now, their shadowy forms flickering in and out of existence, their empty eyes watching my every move. Somehow, I made it back to my apartment. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and bracing myself against it. The whispers quieted, but the air was heavy, suffocating. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The clock on the wall spun wildly, its hands moving faster and faster until it stopped completely. And then, the knocking started. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks at my door. I froze, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. But something else, a force I couldn't explain, compelled me to move. My hand reached for the knob, trembling, and I turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and found myself back in the office. The landlord stood there, smiling that same calm, unnerving smile. "You can't leave," he said simply. I turned to run, but the tenants were behind me, their shadowy forms blocking my path. They closed in, their whispers turning into screams. The last thing I saw was the landlord's face, his eyes dark and endless. "Welcome home," he said, and then everything went black. Months later, the apartment was listed again. A young woman toured the building, admiring its charm and affordability. "It's so quiet," she remarked. The landlord smiled, his ledger open on the desk. "That's what everyone loves about it," he said. "Now, just sign here, and the place is yours." As she signed the lease, a faint knock echoed from deep within the building, but she didn't notice. Mirror of regrets. It started on one of those nights when the world feels unusually quiet. I'd been driving aimlessly, my thoughts heavy after an exhausting week at work. My GPS had lost its signal an hour ago, but I didn't mind. I just wanted to escape, to wander without a destination. The further I drove, the more unfamiliar the streets became. The neat houses and streetlights gave way to broken asphalt and towering trees that leaned over the road like silent sentinels. The air felt different here, damp and cold, even though it had been warm earlier. I realized I hadn't seen another car or a single pedestrian for miles. Just as I started considering turning back, the road opened up into a cul-de-sac, and that's when I saw it. The mansion loomed at the end of the street, its silhouette sharp and jagged against the faint glow of the moon. It was massive, like something out of a Gothic novel, with ivy snaking up its crumbling stone walls. Its windows were dark, some cracked, others boarded up, and the roof sagged under the weight of time. A wrought iron gate stood ajar at the front, its rusted hinges barely holding on. I slowed the car. The engines hummed disturbingly loud in the stillness. Something about the mansion felt off. It wasn't just the decay or the eerie isolation. It was the way it seemed to watch me. I parked at the curb and stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel under my feet. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, and the scent of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. A cold breeze brushed past me, though the trees were completely still. I should have turned around then. Every instinct in me screamed to get back in the car and leave, but I couldn't. My eyes were drawn to the mansion's front door, a massive, arched wooden slab with intricate carvings that were nearly worn away by time. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The closer I got, the less decayed the mansion appeared. The ivy seemed less invasive, the walls less cracked. By the time I reached the door, it almost looked new. I hesitated, hand outstretched toward the door's brass knocker, when it swung open on its own. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the darkness inside. I stepped over the threshold, my shoes clicking against the marble floor. The interior was as unsettling as the exterior. The grand foyer was lined with dusty portraits of stern-faced people, their eyes following me as I moved. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic, like old blood. But then I saw it, a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the rest of the house, it was pristine, polished wood that gleamed faintly in the dim light, with a brass handle that looked freshly cleaned. It stood out so sharply from the decay around it that it felt almost alive. That's when I felt it for the first time, a subtle hum in the air like static before a storm. I didn't want to go near it. But, like the mansion itself, the door seemed to pull me in, its presence demanding my attention. I took a step forward, then another, until I was standing right in front of it. My fingers hovered over the handle, and the hum grew louder, almost like a whisper. And then I turned the knob. At first, life as the cemetery groundskeeper was peaceful, almost meditative. The days were quiet, my tasks repetitive but soothing, trimming the grass, tidying gravestones, and keeping nature's encroachment at bay. But the nights were different. The first few nights were uneventful, though I couldn't shake the eerie silence. It wasn't like the quiet of an empty room. It was a heavy, unnatural stillness, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Then, the whispers started. The first time I heard them, I was locking up the maintenance shed. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur carried by the wind. I paused, straining to hear, but it stopped as soon as I turned my head. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind rustling through the trees, or the distant sound of passing cars. But the whispers grew louder each night. They always started after midnight, weaving through the rows of headstones like an unseen current. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and indistinct, like a crowd murmuring just out of earshot. I tried to ignore it, but one night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the office, following the sound. The whisper seemed to pull me deeper into the cemetery, leading me to the older section where the gravestones were weathered and cracked, their inscriptions worn away by time. As I approached the far corner of the cemetery, the whisper stopped abruptly. In the silence, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't just the cold night air. This was something else. Something watching me. In that corner of the cemetery stood an old, crumbling crypt. Its stone door was sealed shut with heavy iron chains, rusted but sturdy, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. I had seen the crypt during my rounds, but never paid it much attention until now. That night, under the pale glow of the moon, the crypt seemed different. The air around it felt heavier, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the breeze. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The ground in front of the crypt was disturbed, the grass torn up and the dirt uneven, as though someone, or something, had been digging there recently. I shone my flashlight on the door, and that's when I saw it. Scratches on the stone, deep and jagged, as though made by claws. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a faint, rhythmic sound coming from inside. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a faint knocking. I staggered back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but there was none. And then the whispers started again, closer this time, circling me, though there was no one there. I turned and bolted back to the office, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crypt, the claw marks, and the disturbed earth. The next day, I convinced myself I had imagined it all. Maybe I was overtired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me in the darkness. But the following night, things got worse. It was just past midnight when I heard the sound of footsteps outside the office. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel path. I froze, my heart racing. The cemetery was locked after dusk. No one should have been there. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the window, but the path was empty. Then I saw it. A figure stood among the gravestones, shrouded in shadow. It was too far to make out details, but its shape was unmistakably human. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring, or at least I felt it staring, even though I couldn't see its eyes. I turned my flashlight toward it, but the beam flickered and died. When I turned it back on, the figure was gone. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig into the cemetery's history. The next morning, I searched the office for any records or files, hoping to learn more about the crypt. In a dusty cabinet, I found an old leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with handwritten notes from a previous groundskeeper. The entries started innocently enough, detailing daily tasks and minor repairs. But as I flipped through, the tone grew darker. One entry caught my attention. "The whispers are growing louder. I don't think they want me here anymore. The crypt, it's restless. Last night, I saw something near the door, something I can't explain. I'm afraid to go back, but I don't think I have a choice." The last entry was short and chilling. "If anyone reads this, stay away from the crypt. Whatever's inside, it doesn't belong here. And now, neither do I." The journal ended there, with no explanation of what happened to its author. That night, as the whispers returned, I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer. Whatever was happening in that cemetery, it was only getting worse. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, and the air outside felt electric, charged with a sense of inevitability. The crypt, its doors still sealed, its darkness beckoning, drew me in like a magnet. I had to know what was inside. Grabbing the crowbar I kept in the shed, I made my way to the crypt. The night was thick with fog, the cemetery shrouded in an eerie quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The closer I got, the stronger the sensation that something was watching me, following me, clawing at the edges of my mind. I reached the crypt's door and stood there for a long moment, trying to steady my shaking hands. I could feel it, a pressure like a weight pressing against my chest. The knocking came again, louder now, as though whatever was trapped inside wanted out. I jammed the crowbar into the crack between the stones and pried the door open. The chain came loose with a loud snap, and the heavy door groaned as it creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with decay and a strange smell. The scent of rotting earth and something else, something metallic, clung to everything. I stepped inside. The crypt was much larger than I expected, its walls lined with old, cracked stone coffins. But it wasn't the coffins that caught my attention. It was the large, wooden chest in the center of the room. The chest was old, the wood darkened with age, and it looked wrong. Like it had been moved recently, its surface disturbed, as if something had been trying to escape. As I approached, I noticed faint scratches on the wooden surface, like long, desperate claws had raked at it from the inside. I took a deep breath and opened the chest. Inside, there was no body. Instead, there was a bundle of tattered cloth, barely holding together. I reached in cautiously, pulling back the fabric, and froze. Inside the chest was a human skull, cracked and hollowed out. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just the skull itself. It was the eyes. The eyes were still there, though they had long since rotted away, leaving only empty sockets. But beneath the surface of the skull, there was something alive, something pulsing, something that made my stomach churn. It wasn't a body, it was a presence. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, and found myself face to face with the shadowy figure from the graveyard. The one I had seen watching me from among the headstones. It was no longer a shadow. It had form. A tall, gaunt figure, its face a void of darkness with faint, glowing eyes. "You shouldn't have opened it," it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. I backed away, my breath ragged, but the figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. "The crypt isn't a tomb. It's a prison," it continued. "And now that you've awakened it, there's no turning back." I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as the figure advanced. I could feel the cold seep into my bones, the whispers from the cemetery growing louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. The shadows seemed to come alive, creeping along the walls of the crypt, suffocating the light from my flashlight. What are you?" I gasped, stumbling backward. The figure's hollow eyes glowed brighter as it leaned closer. "I am the keeper," it whispered. "I am the one who guards this place. And now you will join us?" In a panic, I turned and ran, crashing through the crypt's exit, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The cemetery had transformed. The graves were no longer just markers of the dead. They were alive. The earth seemed to pulse, as if something deep below was awakening, reaching for me. I could hear the whispers, closer now, surrounding me, drawing me in. I could feel the weight of their presence, the tug of their dark energy. It was all too much. I ran back toward the office, my feet slipping in the dirt, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. I looked behind me, expecting to see the figure, but what I saw made my heart stop. The cemetery was full of shadows, figures without form, their faces obscured. They were all watching me, waiting for me. And then I heard the voice, low and growling, from behind me. "You'll never leave." I ran, my heart thundering in my chest, and finally stumbled back into the office, slamming the door behind me. But it was too late. The shadows followed. The next morning, the cemetery was still. The whispers were gone, and the fog had lifted. It looked like any other peaceful cemetery, the tombstones quiet, the earth undisturbed. But I was gone. When the new groundskeeper arrived, the building was empty. No one had seen me leave, and no one knew where I had gone. They say that the cemetery claims those who uncover its secrets. The whispers still haunt the land, and the figure in the graveyard continues to wait for the next unwitting soul to wander in and awaken the curse once again. And the crypt remains, locked but restless, its dark presence lingering beneath the earth, waiting for the next to make the mistake of uncovering its terrible truth. Watchful patient. I never planned to stay the night at the Silhouette Hotel. It was supposed to be a brief stopover during my road trip, just a place to stretch my legs and grab a quick coffee before heading back on the highway. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and purple, I realized I had miscalculated the time. The next town was hours away, and my body was begging for rest. That's when I saw the sign. It flickered faintly at the edge of the road, its neon letters casting a pale, sickly glow in the growing darkness. Silhouette Hotel, vacancy. The building itself loomed just beyond the trees, its structure a stark silhouette against the twilight, as if the name wasn't just a coincidence. I hesitated. There was something off about the place. The sign was weathered, its letters cracked and flickering erratically, and the hotel itself seemed unnervingly isolated. But exhaustion overruled caution. I pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of my tires breaking the oppressive silence. The Silhouette Hotel was a strange mix of grandeur and decay. Its architecture hinted at a forgotten elegance, with tall, arched windows and intricate stone carvings that had long since faded. But the paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the whole building seemed to sag under the weight of time. I grabbed my bag and approached the front doors, which creaked loudly as I pushed them open. Inside, the lobby was surprisingly pristine. The air was still, almost unnaturally so, and carried the faint scent of polished wood and old books. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching the dim light and scattering it in strange patterns across the walls. There was no one at the front desk. A small brass bell sat on the counter, tarnished with age, and a thick guest book lay open beside it. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing faintly in the empty space. After a moment, an elderly man emerged from a door behind the desk. He moved slowly, deliberately, his pale eyes studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his expression was unreadable. "Welcome to the Silhouette Hotel," he said in a voice that was both soft and cold. "Traveling through?" I nodded, hesitating for a moment before asking, "Do you have any rooms available?" His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We always have rooms available," he said. The key he handed me was old, its brass surface worn smooth from decades of use. A small tag hung from it with the number 214 engraved in elegant script. "Second floor, end of the hall," the man instructed, his tone flat. As I climbed the grand staircase, the air seemed to grow colder with each step. The plush carpet beneath my feet muffled the sound of my movements, and the ornate wallpaper, once vibrant, was now faded and peeling. When I reached the second floor, the hallway stretched before me, eerily long and dimly lit. The doors on either side were identical, their brass numbers dulled with age. Room 214 was at the very end, just as the man had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping the light switch. A single bulb flickered to life, casting weak, uneven light across the room. It was surprisingly clean, though sparsely furnished. A simple bed with crisp white sheets, a wooden nightstand, and an antique wardrobe. The window was covered with heavy curtains, and the air felt still. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, letting out a long sigh. The day's exhaustion was catching up with me, and all I wanted was to sleep. But as I sat there, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling of being watched. I glanced around the room, but there was nothing out of place. Just the faint hum of the overhead light and the steady ticking of an old clock on the wall. Trying to shake off the unease, I lay down, pulling the thin blanket over me. The mattress creaked softly beneath my weight, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to drift off. That's when I heard it, a faint knock. It came from somewhere beyond the walls, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. At first, I thought it might be the pipes or the creaking of the old building. But then it came again, 3 distinct knocks, slow and deliberate. They weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from the wardrobe. For a moment, I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get out of the room. The knocks from the wardrobe weren't loud, but they were deliberate, too precise to be random creaks of old wood. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me after a long day. But as I stepped closer to the wardrobe, the air in the room seemed to shift. It grew heavier, colder, as though the space itself was bracing for something. With a shaking hand, I reached for the wardrobe's handle and pulled it open. Inside, the wardrobe was empty. No clothes, no hangers, nothing but the faint scent of mothballs and aged wood. I let out a shaky laugh, relieved but unnerved. As I turned to close it, something caught my eye, a faint handprint on the back panel, as if someone had pressed their palm against the wood from the inside. The handprint was small, almost childlike, and it glistened faintly, as though it had been left there recently. I stepped back, shutting the wardrobe quickly and trying to shake off the creeping unease. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old building sent my nerves on edge. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and measured, as though someone was pacing back and forth outside my door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then came a soft knock at my door, 3 taps, identical to the ones from the wardrobe. I didn't answer. Instead, I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Before I could even let out a sigh of relief, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. But the peephole still showed nothing. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The knocking stopped, replaced by a sound that chilled me to the bone, a faint, childlike giggle. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room. I spun around, scanning the room frantically, but it was empty. The wardrobe was shut tight, the bed undisturbed. Everything was exactly as it had been. That's when I noticed the mirror. The room had an old, ornate mirror hanging above the dresser. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now it seemed off. In the dim light, my reflection seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows around my face deeper and more pronounced. And then as I stared, I saw it. A figure moved behind me. It was small, its outline faint and flickering like a candle's flame. It darted across the room, disappearing into the corner where the wardrobe stood. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was wrong. My expression was blank, my eyes hollow, and in the reflection, the wardrobe door was wide open. I turned again, and sure enough, the wardrobe was now ajar, its empty interior yawning like a void. Panic set in. I grabbed my bag and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The hallway was dimly lit, the old sconces casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. As I hurried toward the staircase, I noticed something strange. The other doors along the hallway were all slightly open, just enough to reveal the darkness inside. And from each room, I could feel eyes watching me, 100 unseen gazes following my every step. I quickened my pace, refusing to look inside any of the rooms. But as I reached the staircase, a figure appeared at the end of the hall. It was the old man from the front desk, though he looked different. His face was pale and sunken, his eyes clouded and lifeless. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice echoing unnaturally. I didn't respond. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty lobby. When I reached the front door, I found it locked. The brass handle wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I twisted it. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but the night outside was silent. Behind me, the whispers started again. I turned to see shadows pooling in the corners of the room, crawling along the walls and floor like living things. They moved toward me, slow but deliberate, their forms shifting and twisting as they drew closer. The old man stood at the center of the lobby, his head tilted slightly as he watched me struggle. "You can't leave," he said softly. "You're part of the hotel now." The chandelier above began to flicker, casting the room in alternating light and darkness. In the brief flashes of light, I saw them. Figures standing just beyond the shadows, their faces obscured, but their presence undeniable. They were the hotel's other guests, and they were waiting for me. I backed away from the door, my heart racing as the shadows closed in around me. The old man stood unmoving, his pale eyes locked on me, his expression unreadable. "This hotel has stood here for centuries," he began, his voice cold and hollow. "It feeds on those who stumble in, those who ignore the warnings and step willingly into its embrace. I don't belong here," I shouted, desperate. The old man tilted his head, almost amused. "You chose this place, and now it's chosen you." The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, filling my ears until I could barely think. The figures in the shadows grew more distinct. Men, women, even children, all with blank faces and hollow eyes. They reached out toward me, their fingers stretching impossibly long, their movements slow but deliberate. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a rug and crashing to the floor. My flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam cutting through the darkness and momentarily illuminating the figures. That's when I saw it. Each figure bore a mark, a faint outline of the hotel's logo burned into their skin like a brand. And their faces, they were distorted, stretched into grotesque, silent screams. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it toward the old man. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink, but the light seemed to push back the shadows around him, giving me just enough room to move. I bolted toward the stairs leading to the basement. It was the only door in the lobby that wasn't locked, the only place I hadn't tried. The staircase spiraled downward into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. My breathing was ragged, each gasp echoing off the stone walls. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as though the hotel itself was alive, chasing me deeper into its heart. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a large, iron door. It was heavy, rusted, and covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. The whispers turned into screams. They clawed at the edges of my mind, filling my head with images, faces of the trapped, moments of their despair. I grabbed the handle of the door and pulled with all my strength. It creaked open, revealing a cavernous room lit by a dim, unnatural light. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate mirror, its surface rippling like water. The air around it felt alive, vibrating with a strange energy. As I stepped closer, the figures from the shadows began to appear again, this time in the mirror's surface. They were clearer now, their faces twisted in agony, their hands pressed against the glass as if trying to escape. "This is where it keeps us," a voice whispered. I turned to see a young woman standing behind me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She looked as though she had been there for years, her clothes tattered, her skin almost translucent. "You have to break it," she said, her voice urgent. It's the only way to free us. To stop it. Before I could respond, the old man appeared at the top of the stairs. His face was no longer human. It was twisted, a hollow void of darkness where his eyes and mouth should have been. You don't understand, he growled, his voice deep and echoing. The mirror is the heart of the hotel. If you break it, you'll destroy everything, including yourself. The room began to shake, the ground beneath me rumbling as the shadows poured in, their shapes writhing and twisting, closing in around me. The woman grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the mirror. You have to choose, she said. Break it or stay here forever. I looked at the mirror, then back at the old man. He stood motionless, his presence commanding, as though he knew my hesitation. If you break it, you'll free them, he said, his voice almost pleading now. But you'll never leave. The hotel will claim you instead. The screams of the trapped souls grew louder, their faces pressing harder against the mirror's surface. The woman's grip tightened, her eyes filled with desperation. I took a deep breath, raising the flashlight high above my head. The old man lunged forward, his form dissolving into a massive shadow, reaching for me as I brought the flashlight down with all my strength. The mirror shattered. The moment the glass broke, the room was consumed by light. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was blinding, searing, and it felt like it was tearing me apart. The screams stopped. The shadows dissolved. And then there was silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of an empty lot. The Silhouette Hotel was gone, replaced by an overgrown field. The only sign that it had ever existed was a small, broken shard of glass at my feet. But something was wrong. I could still feel the weight of the hotel's presence, a coldness deep in my chest that hadn't been there before. And as I looked down at my reflection in the shard of glass, I saw them, faint figures standing behind me, their hollow eyes watching. The hotel was gone, but its curse wasn't. I had freed the others, but now I was part of it. The Forgotten Carnival. It was late autumn when I stumbled upon the carnival. The trees along the country road were bare, their gnarled branches clawing at the gray sky, and the air carried that sharp, biting chill that comes just before the first frost. I was driving aimlessly, trying to clear my head. Life had been heavy lately, work stress, family drama, the suffocating feeling that I was stuck in place. So I did what I always do when the wall started closing in. I drove. The road wound through dense woods, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. I hadn't passed a gas station or a single sign of civilization for what felt like hours when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a faint, golden glow cutting through the trees, accompanied by the distant sound of carnival music. It was faint, almost like a memory, a calliope tune that carried an oddly cheerful, yet hollow, quality. I slowed the car, rolling down my window to listen. The music was real. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the road and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. The music was louder now, and with it came the faint sound of laughter. Children's laughter, high-pitched and gleeful, mixed with the deeper rumble of voices and the occasional crack of fireworks. I should have turned back. I should have gotten in my car and driven away. But something about that music pulled me in like a thread wrapped around my chest, tugging me forward. Pushing through the thicket, I emerged into a clearing, and there it was, a sprawling carnival bathed in warm, golden light. It looked as though it had been plucked straight from the pages of a storybook. Brightly painted tents lined the edges of the grounds, their vibrant colors standing in stark contrast to the muted tones of the forest. Strings of twinkling lights arched over cobblestone paths, leading to a towering Ferris wheel that creaked softly as it turned. There were booths with hand-painted signs promising games, prizes, and sweets. A carousel spun in the distance, its painted horses frozen in mid-gallop, their glassy eyes glinting in the light. And at the heart of it all stood a grand, striped tent, its peaks stretching high into the sky, the fabric rippling gently as if it were breathing. But there was something off. Despite the vibrant colors and the cheerful music, the air felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet, as though the sounds and lights were a thin veneer masking something much darker. And then I noticed the people. They moved through the carnival like shadows, their faces indistinct, their forms flickering at the edges of my vision. No one seemed to notice me, or maybe they didn't care. A man in a top hat walked past, twirling a cane. A young girl in a tattered dress clutched a balloon that floated far too high, its strings stretching impossibly long. "Welcome," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see a woman standing there, her face pale and her smile unervingly wide. She wore a crimson dress that shimmered in the light, and her eyes, dark, piercing, and ancient, seemed to see straight through me. "You're just in time," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "The show's about to begin." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as if she had never been there. I wanted to leave, to turn around and head back to my car, but when I looked over my shoulder, the path I had come through was gone. There was only the carnival now, stretching endlessly in every direction. And I had the sinking feeling that once you entered this place, there was no leaving. I wandered through the carnival, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestone paths. The music was louder now, but it didn't feel cheerful anymore. It was off-tune, discordant, like a melody trying to hold itself together but slipping apart at the edges. The booths were filled with games that should have been fun. Ring toss, balloon darts, even a fortune-teller's stand, but something about them felt sinister. At one booth, a man in a pinstripe suit offered me a try at knocking down bottles with a baseball. "First game's on the house," he said, his smile stretched too wide, his teeth too sharp. I hesitated, but his gaze was unrelenting, like he was daring me to play. Reluctantly, I picked up a ball and threw it. It hit the bottle's dead center, but instead of toppling over, they didn't move. The man's grin widened. "Better luck next time." As I turned to walk away, I felt his eyes boring into the back of my neck. Further in, I found the carousel. It spun slowly, the painted horses rising and falling in a lazy rhythm. Something about it drew me closer, though I couldn't explain why. The air around it was colder, the warmth of the carnival lights barely touching this part of the grounds. As I approached, I noticed the horses weren't just painted. They were hyper-realistic. Too realistic. Their manes looked like actual hair, their eyes glassy and full of emotion, as though they were alive but frozen in place. A small brass plaque on the side of the carousel caught my attention. It read, "One ride, one memory." I stepped back, uneasy, but before I could turn away, the carousel began to slow. The music shifted, playing a haunting melody that sounded achingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. "Care for a ride?" a voice asked. I looked up to see a woman standing by the controls, her face partially obscured by a hood. Her eyes glittered in the dim light, and her smile was as cold as the air around her. I didn't want to, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me to one of the horses. The second I climbed on, the carousel jerked to life, spinning faster and faster until the world blurred around me. The music grew louder, deafening, and then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on the carousel anymore. I was standing in my childhood bedroom. The walls were painted the same pale blue, the bed neatly made with the quilt my grandmother had sewn. It was so real, so vivid, that I could smell the faint scent of lavender from the old dresser. But it wasn't a memory I wanted to revisit. The door creaked open, and there she was, my mother. She looked younger, healthier, the way I remembered her before the illness took hold. She smiled at me, her eyes warm and kind, but something was wrong. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and when she spoke, her voice was hollow, echoing. "Why did you leave me?" she asked. Her question hit me like a punch to the chest. I had tried so hard to move on, to bury the guilt of not being there when she passed. But here she was, pulling it all back to the surface. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my throat tight. Her smile faded. The warmth in her eyes disappeared, replaced by something cold and empty. She stepped closer, and her hand reached out, her fingers twisting unnaturally. "Why did you leave me?" she repeated, her voice growing louder, angrier. I turned to run, but the room began to collapse, the walls crumbling into darkness. The last thing I saw before everything went black again was her face, distorted and inhuman, her hollow eyes staring into mine. I jolted awake on the carousel, gasping for air. The ride had stopped, and the carnival was silent. The lights had dimmed, and the air was heavier, suffocating. The woman in the hood was gone, but the brass plaque remained. The words had changed. One ride, one price. My legs trembled as I stumbled away from the carousel, but the carnival didn't let me go. The crowd of shadowy figures had grown, and they were no longer indifferent to me. They turned to watch, their faceless heads tilting in unison as I passed. The laughter and music had turned into whispers, unintelligible but insistent, as though the carnival itself was speaking to me. I needed to find a way out. At the heart of the carnival stood the grand striped tent, its peaks stretching high into the dark sky. I had avoided it until now, but something told me that whatever answers I was looking for would be inside. The entrance flaps billowed gently, as though inviting me in. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But when I glanced behind me, the crowd of shadowy figures had started to move, their steps slow but deliberate. I didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the tent. Inside, the world shifted. The air was thick and stifling, and the space felt impossibly large, like I had walked into a void. At the center of the tent stood a ringmaster, dressed in crimson and gold, his top hat tilted just enough to hide his eyes. "Welcome to the main event," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You've been chosen for a very special performance." As he spoke, the shadows from outside began to seep into the tent, swirling around me, their forms growing taller and more menacing. The ringmaster raised his hand, and with a snap of his fingers, the shadows lunged. The shadows swirled around me, their forms growing darker and more solid. They towered over me, their shapes shifting and flickering like flames in the wind. "Tonight's performance is a special one," the ringmaster said, his voice booming across the cavernous tent. He spread his arms wide, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "You, my dear guest, are the star." I backed away, my heart pounding, but the shadows closed in, forming a circle around me. Their hollow faces were impossible to read, but I could feel their intent. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The ringmaster clapped his hands, and the tent transformed. The dirt floor gave way to polished wood, and rows of shadowy figures appeared in seats that hadn't been there before. A spotlight fell on me, its harsh beam blinding, and the ringmaster's voice echoed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a tale of regret and redemption." The shadows began to shift, their forms taking on familiar shapes. I froze as I recognized them. Faces from my past, people I had wronged, people I had loved and lost. My mother appeared first, her expression cold and accusing. "You left me," she said, her voice echoing through the tent. "You abandoned me when I needed you most." "No, I didn't," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. I tried. But my voice was drowned out as more figures emerged. Old friends I had betrayed, a lover whose heart I had broken, even strangers whose lives I had touched in fleeting, painful ways. Each one spoke, their voices blending into a cacophony of anger and sorrow. Their words were like knives, cutting deep, dredging up every ounce of guilt and shame I had ever buried. Enough! I screamed, falling to my knees. What do you want from me? The ringmaster stepped forward, his grin never wavering. The carnival thrives on stories, he said, his tone almost gentle now. And your story is filled with pain, regret, and guilt. It's delicious, but there's a way to end it. I looked up at him, desperate. How? He gestured toward the center of the tent, where a large, ornate mirror had appeared. Its surface rippled like water, and as I stared into it, I saw my reflection. But it wasn't just me. It was my life, every moment of it, playing out in vivid detail. All you have to do, the ringmaster said, is step through. Leave your story behind, and you'll be free of your pain. Free of everything. I hesitated, my hands trembling. The mirror called to me, its surface shimmering with a strange, hypnotic light. But something about it felt wrong. What happens if I don't? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The ringmaster's grin widened, and he leaned in close. Then you stay, here, with us, forever. The shadows pressed closer, their hands reaching for me, their voices growing louder until it was unbearable. The shadows closed in, their whispers filling my ears, urging me to step through the mirror. My mother's voice was the loudest, her face appearing in the glass, her eyes filled with sorrow. You can make it right, she said. Come with me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. It felt warm, inviting, like the promise of escape. But then I remembered something, a small, fleeting memory of my mother's real smile, the warmth in her eyes when she used to hold me as a child. This wasn't her. It couldn't be. No, I said, pulling my hand back. This isn't real. None of this is real. The ringmaster's smile faltered for the first time, and the shadows began to writhe, their forms becoming unstable. You can't refuse, he hissed, his voice losing its charm and turning cold. Watch me, I said, standing tall. I grabbed the mirror with both hands and slammed it to the ground. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard reflecting the faces of the shadows as they screamed in unison. The tent began to collapse, the fabric tearing and the ground shaking. The shadows dissolved into smoke, the ringmaster's form flickering like a dying flame. You'll regret this, he snarled, his voice echoing as he vanished into the darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in the middle of the forest, the carnival nowhere in sight. The morning sun filtered through the trees, and the sound of birdsong replaced the haunting music that had filled my ears. I sat up, my heart still racing, and looked around. There was no sign of the carnival, no lights, no tents, just an empty clearing. But as I stood, I felt something in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out a small golden ticket. The words on it were faint but unmistakable. Admit one. I stared at it, my mind racing. Was it a warning? A promise? Or a reminder of what I had escaped? I crumpled the ticket and threw it to the ground, but as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the carnival wasn't truly gone. It was still out there, waiting for its next guest. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.